So, when I say the word pirate, what pops into your head? Probably a swashbuckling hero, right? A parrot on the shoulder, a sword in hand. We've got this image of a thrilling life, total freedom, and of course, chests overflowing with gold. But what was it really like back in the golden age of piracy? Well, that's what we're going to dig into.
I mean, we all grew up with this exact story, didn't we? The weathered old treasure map, the remote desert island, and that big red X marking the spot where unimaginable riches are just waiting to be found. It's the absolute cornerstone of the whole pirate legend.
But this is where the real story starts to get interesting. When archaeologists find actual pirate shipwrecks, like Blackbeard's famous Queen Anne's Revenge, the things they pull from the seafloor tell a completely different tale. They uncover a reality that's way more complex and, honestly, a whole lot more fascinating than any of the fiction.
Okay, so first things first, let's tackle the biggest myth of them all, that legendary buried treasure.
That's right. The entire idea of pirates burying their treasure, it pretty much comes from one place, Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Treasure Island. And look, it was a fantastic plot device for a book, but it just wasn't something real pirates did. There are almost no documented cases of it ever happening.
So what were they actually after? Well, think practical, immediate value. We're talking about coins that could be spent in the next port. Weapons, navigation tools, food, wine, even just bolts of cloth. Piracy was a business, you know? They needed to turn their loot into supplies and wages as fast as possible. Burying your payroll in the sand, it just makes no sense.
All right, so if they weren't chaotic treasure barriers, then what were they? This is where things get really wild. Let's take a look at how a ship full of guys who'd rejected all authority managed to work together without, immediately falling into chaos. The myth, of course, paints them as this lawless mob of anarchic marauders. But the reality? The reality was something incredibly radical for its time. A pirate ship was, for all intents and purposes, a floating democratic republic, a society governed by its own set of surprisingly fair and orderly laws.
And their system was brilliant. Before a voyage even started, the entire crew would get together to debate and vote on the ship's articles, the pirate code. I mean, look at this. Every single man gets an equal vote. The captain is elected and can be voted out. Everyone gets a fair share of the plunder. These rules weren't just random ideas. They were a direct reaction to the horrible, tyrannical conditions they'd all suffered on merchant or navy ships. This was their declaration of independence.
And get this, they basically had an early form of workers' compensation. Before any of the loot was divided up, money was set aside for anyone who got hurt. Losing your right arm, as you can see, would get you 600 pieces of 8. A leg, 500. This was a kind of social safety net that was completely unheard of on any other ship in the world at that time. And to make sure no one person got too powerful, they came up with this genius separation of powers. You had the captain, who is basically the war chief. He had absolute authority, but only during a battle or a chase. The rest of the time, the real power was with the quartermaster, the peace chief. He was elected by the crew to look out for their interests, divvy up the food, and handle discipline. It was a whole system of checks and balances, born from really bitter experience. Okay, so they had a working democracy at sea, but what was daily life actually like? What were they eating? Because it wasn't all rum and lavish feasts, that's for sure. Most of the time, their diet was the same miserable stuff every other sailor had to endure. Hardtack, these flour and water biscuits so tough you had to soak them just to chew, and they were almost always crawling with weevils. Meat, so packed in salt you had to soak it for hours. This was the grim reality of life at sea, the very thing they were trying to escape. But this is where pirates had a huge advantage. Unlike a merchant ship on a tight schedule, pirates were masters of their own time. That freedom meant they could stop at islands to hunt wild animals, fish for fresh tuna, or catch giant sea turtles, which they could keep alive on deck for weeks. And of course, the best meals of all came straight from the pantries of the ships they captured. And they got pretty creative with their spoils. A really popular dish was something called salmagundi. It was kind of this everything but the kitchen sink hash. You'd chop up whatever meats you had, throw in some anchovies, hard-boiled eggs, pickled vegetables, and douse it all in spices. A very welcome change from salted pork and weevils, you can bet on that. So we're building this picture of a democratic, pretty well-fed brotherhood. But was it only a brotherhood? Let's talk about the forgotten stories of the women who sailed under the black flag. It's a question that kind of messes with that classic image of a pirate crew, right? Now, most pirate codes did explicitly forbid women on board, mostly to keep the peace, but it wasn't an absolute rule. Historians figured that about 1% of pirates during the Golden Age were women. Now, 1% sounds tiny, I know, but when you're talking about thousands upon thousands of pirates out there on the seas, that's still dozens of women who chose this life.
And they got there in totally different ways. I mean, take the two most famous ones. Bonny fell in love with Captain Calico Jack Rackham and just joined his crew, sailing openly as a woman. But then you have Mary Read, who spent most of her life disguised as a boy, even serving in the British Army, before she ended up a pirate. Her own crewmates had no idea she was a woman until Bonny figured it out.
So we have this much more complex reality of democratic rule, practical goals, and even a small place for women. So why? Why does that romantic myth of the swashbuckling treasure hunter still have such a powerful grip on us?
Well, the truth is, the romance of piracy really only exists in our heads. The actual life was brutal. It was often short, and it was filled with sickness, hard work, and constant danger. It was a life chosen not for adventure, but out of pure desperation. For these men and women, becoming a pirate was the only way to escape the slave-like conditions on merchant and naval ships.
So when you look at it, the real pirates were far more interesting than the myths we tell about them. They were rebels who built a radical democracy on the high seas. They were outcasts who demanded a fair shot. They were desperate people who chose a short, free life over a long one in chains. And maybe that's the real reason the legend lives on. Because in the end, their greatest prize wasn't buried treasure. What they truly captured was our imagination, and gave us this powerful, lasting symbol of what it means to be truly free.